everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Saturday, April 22nd. And today we're going to chat with our good friend Barry Jacobsen. We're going to take a look at the world. You know, there's three big stories that we want to get into with Barry tonight. North Korea continues to go on, and I'm curious about what are the military options in North Korea? Are there any? Are there any realistic military options in that North Korea situation? Then there is Syria, where a couple of weeks ago we took military action, and the question is what happened next, or what happens next. There's a certain defiance on the part of Syria, and now Russia is getting into it as well. So it's an interesting situation. Overall, lots and lots of challenges that President Obama has left Mr. Trump. You know, we used to talk, I remember last year, we did several shows with Barry about the national security challenges that the next president was going to face. Well, I have to tell you, they've turned out to be even worse than I thought they were going to be. Some real problems. And finally, we're going to take a look at the situation in France, where in the next 24 to 36 hours, I think we're going to have a pretty good idea of where France is going. It looks like there's going to be a second round. More than likely, that's what will happen. But nevertheless, it'll be an interesting thing to think about. Let's say hello to our good friend Barry Jacobsen. How are you, Barry?
Hello, Silvio. How are you? It's been a while.
It's been a while, but it's always fun to reconnect. We're gonna put our World War II series off for a week here, and look at some of these very serious world problems. But before we do, we got to have at least a little bit of fun here for a minute. I'm sure you, my fellow baby boomer, remember Peter Frampton. Well, he's 67 today, if you can believe that, Barry. That great double album that everybody had back in 1976, you know. I think that was his only big album, but it was certainly a good one, Barry.
Frampton's quite an amazing guy. You know a lot about these sort of things. You may already know this, but for your audience's sake, Frampton actually was a contemporary and boyhood friend of David Bowie's. They both went to the same school in England. By the time Frampton was 18, he'd already been in 3 bands. The last one, by the time he was 18, was called The Herd, and it was being produced by Bill Wyman of the Rolling Stones.
Right, the bass player, yeah.
That's right. And then shortly thereafter, he joined Humble Pie, one of the biggest groups in 1969.
Right.
And eventually, he went his own way, and by the mid '70s, 1976, he released his solo album, "Frampton Comes Alive," which was the best-selling live album of the decade, and one of the best-selling of all time.
That's right. And one of the great things about the groups in that time is that they had great names. Humble Pie is a good example of that. Humble Pie. What a great title that is for a group. What a great name, Humble Pie. That and Mott the People, that was the other one, too, that I thought had a great name for a group. Well, the other big story in the musical world on this day, now this was kind of a unique one because it started out as a segment on Saturday Night Live, the Blues Brothers, and it became huge. I mean, before you knew it, they had an album out, they had a hit song out, and pretty soon they made one of the funniest movies that I've ever seen called The Blues Brothers, and that was in 1980. So it was tonight on Saturday Night Live, 1978, that Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi, I thought that was perhaps the greatest. That and the Czechoslovakian Brothers were probably the 2 greatest segments of Saturday Night Live. Remember those two?
Vaguely. I mean, you're talking about the early, cast. That was probably the first generation. A lot of those guys, Dan Aykroyd, Chevy Chase, Gilda Radner, Bill Murray, John Belushi, they all came from basically 2 areas. And Lorne Michaels started Saturday Night Live. They either came from the National Lampoon, or a comedy troupe called Second City out of Chicago. And really, that's where the roots of that first generation that was so terrific of performers comes from.
Right, and still my favorite, those years are still my favorite Saturday night shows. They rerun them a lot on there was one channel that kept rerunning them, and to me, they're still the best time. Garrett Morris, I think, was in that time frame as well. Chico Escuela, the baseball player. I thought that was another one too. So I just thought that was fantastic. But the Blues Brothers, I mean, who would have thought that when they did that segment that night that it would become the story that it did? But it really did. Well, who would have thought a year ago, Barry, when we were doing our shows about national security and the challenges that the next president was going to face? I don't think even you and I thought it would be this challenging. I mean, it's really a mess out there. And let's begin with North Korea, where it seems like every day there's a new threat, there's a new challenge. And I keep asking myself, Barry, what are the options? What are the military options, if any, in North Korea? I kind of like to hear from you on that, Barry.
Well, they're pretty bleak, Silvio. There's not much, I think, that we can really do to, short of a bloodbath, to put an end militarily to this dictator and his nuclear pretensions. His nuclear capability aside, and it's a growing capability, and it's a very dangerous one. Give him time to eventually have an ICBM that can hit the west coast of the United States. He can already hit Guam or Japan or other places we have American troops or allies. But what's really makes it the situation intractable is that he's got hundreds of thousands of troops right on the border, his whole army, I think it's something like 4 million men, and thousands of artillery tubes, and artillery and mortar tubes that can hit the capital city of South Korea, Seoul. Very densely populated area. There is estimates that several million people would die in the first few days or be injured in the first few days of a war in which he let loose with everything he had in order to punish us for trying to take out his nuclear capability. And the second thing that makes it difficult is that there is no country in the world that is more riddled with tunnels and which uses underground facilities. There's no country that does it more than North Korea. When I was in the Army, there was frequent findings of North Korean tunnels bordering under the DMZ. Literally boring underground, underneath the border, and commando teams from North Korea would periodically spring up, it's kind of like drug smugglers on the Mexican border, would spring up in South Korea and wreak havoc. And so why is that important? Well, because a lot of his nuclear capability, his facilities are underground, which means the only thing you can hit them with effectively is either another nuclear weapon, and that one especially designed as a bunker buster, meaning that it explodes once it's penetrated underground, not on the surface. Or you can do it with a MOAB, designed for the same thing we used in Afghanistan a couple weeks ago. So but the chance of getting anything like all those weapons and taking them out or all of his research facility is very remote. But right. It is certain that he would respond with a massive attack on South Korea.
You would almost have to, I was, strategizing a little bit this afternoon about this topic and thinking to myself that about the only way it would work is if we were to do such a preemptive attack of such a magnitude that it would basically cut off the head, if you will, so effectively that we would not allow him to retaliate. I don't know if that's possible. But that's the only thing that I can possibly think of, because if he has any chance to retaliate, it would be, as you say, thousands of people would be killed. I mean, it's not an easy choice. Perhaps China can help. Do you think they're helping, or do you think that we've done enough to get them to help?
No, I don't. I think that China has been using North Korea for the last 50 years as a cat's paw to strike out at the United States, or at least to vex us. And every time that we start to press China on something we find reprehensible in their behavior, whether it be the South China Sea or currency manipulation, they have North Korea distract us by rattling sabers and doing nuclear tests. If you remember, Trump came into office promising to punish China for currency manipulation, Of course, we've been talking for 2 years now about the Chinese military buildup in the South China Sea, where they've been illegally seizing islands that are in international waters. And all that's gone by the wayside. All talk of Trump punishing them or bringing them to the table over these things has gone by the wayside, as instead we're forced to go back to them to try to control North Korea, which they have no interest in doing.
Well, I just don't see a happy ending here, Barry, because and the reason I say that is that the way North Korea is behaving, firing missiles and just being North Korea, but a lot more dangerous than maybe 10 or 20 years ago. I just think one of those missiles one of these days is going to hit the wrong place. They're either going to hit our troops or one of our ships or somebody else's city, and then we're going to walk into a war because we're going to have to retaliate in some form. So I don't see any happy ending here. I mean, I say this, it sounds kind of facetious, but I don't mean it that way. But I think I would not want to be in Seoul, South Korea. I think I would want to move out because they're going to be one of, they're going to be one of the, I mean, that's like, reminds me of my mother's joke, during the missile crisis, when, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, my mother's joke, the night that President Kennedy gave the speech, we were sitting there in the living room listening to the speech in Spanish, and my mother, after the speech, says, "Well, I guess we'll be the first ones to go," meaning that we were going to be the battleground, for the first battle. So anyway,
you mentioned this, and it deserves to be elaborated on just a little bit. The North Koreans are always firing off test missiles and such, and they may eventually actually strike a target, intentionally or not. But there's also another trigger point that could happen much sooner, which is that we've got an armada, quote unquote, which is really a carrier task force, an aircraft carrier plus its supporting ships, the Carl Vinson, I believe, and 5 escort ships, are heading towards the Korean Peninsula. Now that, combined with annual maneuvers that we have been holding in South Korea, has got Kim, the dictator of North Korea, on edge. And he's an edgy guy anyway. He's not somebody who's particularly stable. And I think his worldview is weirdly skewed by living in a country where he's venerated as a god. And I think he's not used to hearing anything close to the truth or reality. I really think that Kim believes that North Korea is a much more powerful player on the world stage than it really is. And this sort of delusion is dangerous because he's used to shooting anyone who bothers him, anyone who gets in his way, anyone who vexes him. And if he feels vexed by the United States, he may think he is strong enough to take on the United States. And that's very dangerous because when he starts attacking us directly, we have to respond, and then you have a war. And your listeners should remember, as we talked about during the World War I series, it was the shooting of Archduke Ferdinand that led to the Austro-Hungarian Empire building up its forces on the border of Serbia, and that led to a chain of events that brought the entire western part of the world to war. All of Europe went to war over that. So very small actions can have very big consequences.
That's right. Now, you're exactly right that this young man in charge of North Korea is probably living in some kind of a fantasy, but I have to believe, and maybe it's just maybe I'm just wishful thinking, but I have to believe that all those men around him, all those military men that we always see around him, who for the most part were probably working for his father, I have to believe that those men are a bit more realistic and understand what kind of danger he could be getting into, because I think they just have to know. Now, another theory that I heard, Barry, was that the Chinese would just take him out. The Chinese have apparently put troops on the border with North Korea. They've refused to buy some raw materials from North Korea. And so you never know. Maybe the Chinese can take him out in one of their mysterious ways. maybe he can drink something that never wakes up, that kind of thing.
Well, that's certainly possible. That sort of skullduggery is not beyond China or Russia, who they seem to routinely poison people they don't like. And they may have another candidate, that perhaps a general waiting in the wings. But keep in mind, when you talk about North Korean generals that surround Kim, when he came to power, he executed a bunch of them, including his own uncle, who was the Minister of Defense. If I remember right, he had them walk out to an airfield and then had an anti-aircraft cannon blow them up. So, he kills these guys in rather dramatic fashion. I don't think there's a lot of people standing around him who are anything but yes men. I don't think there's a lot of truth tellers in that group. And I'm not even sure that, as you mentioned, that they themselves know what's really going on in the world, because North Korea is called the Hermit Kingdom. Actually, the whole peninsula was once called the Hermit Kingdom. But the name still sticks in the north. They don't have a lot of ties to the rest of the world. They don't get out much. And I don't know that they realize that, even though, and keep in mind, too, also the conventional strength of the North Korean army is very large. Our army, for instance, is just over 1 million men. Their army is 4 million men. If you just look at a conventional strength and don't calculate things like technology and force multipliers, somebody like Kim could be deluded, and as good as generals, into thinking that they're much bigger and stronger than they really are.
Well, that's probably true. I think that happens with a lot of these people, as you say, who don't have a lot of truthful information around them. Before we take a break, I wanted to change the subject just a little bit. The bomb that we dropped in Afghanistan, that huge bomb, what is your best gut feeling or estimate of how many of those bombs we have that we could use at, not necessarily at one time, but what kind of an inventory do you think we have of those kinds of bombs? Could it be 20, 30, 100? What's your gut feeling?
I have pretty good information that we have about 50 of those. That's the semi-classified. I won't be put in jail for telling you that, but it's not the number that you normally get. But my sources tell me about 51 is the number. These are called the Moab, which stands for Mother of All Bomb. It was developed as a bunker-busting bomb, something large enough to take out Iranian underground nuclear sites, or cave complexes in Afghanistan. It's a ground-penetrating device that explodes thereafter. That's one way it can be configured. It also can be configured to explode on the surface as well, though there are other munitions that do that job better. And by the way, the Trump administration and came under a lot of scrutiny and a lot of criticism from journalists and some politicians on the left for using a Moab there, as though he was just trying to strut his stuff and show how tough he was using a big bomb and wasting a lot of money doing it. Turns out that the Trump administration, the White House didn't have anything to do with that. That was a call by General Nicholson, who is the commander-in-chief of our forces in Afghanistan. And as a very refreshing sign of change, now military targets and weapons used for those targets are not being determined by Valerie Jarrett, for instance, in the White House. They're being determined by the generals on the ground.
Or Susan Rice, or somebody like that, or somebody like that in the White House. No, that was to me the most important part of the story. Not necessarily the bomb itself and what a spectacle it must have been, but just the fact that a commander over there could make that call. I think that was the most promising side of the story. Barry, we're going to take a little break, and then when we come back, we'll talk about Syria, and we'll talk a little bit about this election coming up in France.